Hello, my name is Annie, and my project is on language reforms in the 20th century, specifically the Romanization in China, Vietnam, and Turkey. The 20th century was an important period because many countries following World Wars I and II were going through orthographic reforms, and so as I earlier stated, we'll be focusing on the Romanization of China, Vietnam, and Turkey and how they were achieved, specifically looking at factors that supported or hindered the success of the implementation of the Latin alphabet as the country's official orthographic system. So while conducting the research, I really only used the UVC Online Library database and Google Scholar because that's what is readily available to me, with only using Boolean searches to kind of compact the searches with keywords, orthographic reform, romanization, script reform, and in the case of China, things like simplification, or with Vietnam, like genome or Quốc ngữ. And then I always set the filters to like full text online and open access, scholarly works, only articles written in English because that's all I understand, preferably written in the last 2 decades, but we'll put the limit of anything after 1970s just because certain articles that I used referenced other articles that were pre-2000s. And with the Romanization cases for Turkey, we're focusing on specifically the Republic of Turkey, not any other Turkic countries that were once part of the Ottoman Empire that are like in the Baltic areas that were eventually part of the Soviet Union, for Vietnam, and then China. All right, for China, so the first article, the Pan et al. 2015, they mostly went off of these previous schemes, one by Cooper and the other by Ager, not sure. But the point being to split the simplification movements into 3 stages and then further analyze those stages and looking at the motives behind those stages. I found the first article for Cooper, it made lots of sense, but it was more like a reiteration of what kind of what happened in general. And then the second article, Ager, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, his 7i model, the way that they presented it in the article was really confusing and just really, to someone who can't read it, quite unintelligible until they explain the results of those graphs later on. But yeah, they focus on the simplification process. The next one by Zhong is actually his or her, I'm not sure by their name, dissertation. And they're focusing on the romanization and transformation of the Chinese script throughout the 20th century. And then they also really specified between the Romanization movement and the Latinization movement. And normally, Romanization and Latinization are kind of the words that can be used back and forth. As yeah. So when I first saw this, I was quite taken aback. But they really do make a difference between the two, which makes you consider things when you read other articles that kind of just call it the Romanization movement or just call it the Latinization movement. You kind of consider it differently, I guess. The next one, as for Vietnam, in the first article, the 2002 article, because their article was more like a not only Vietnam, but like it included all of the countries that are part of the Sinosphere, including Taiwan. I only focused on their Vietnam section primarily. So they talked about just kind of Vietnam in general, and with the French colonization, and how Trung Quốc ngữ grew from something that was promoted from the French or promoted by the French as something that will distance the Vietnamese from their Chinese connections, and slowly grow closer to the French. But then it changed into something that was used by nationalists and revolutionaries against French and Chinese. And then Martucci's article is mostly a article about Vietnam, but adds in a little thing at the end where he questions if Chinese characters will last, or more so, what is their future like? And he argues that a major reason for Trung Quốc ngữ success was because of the Vietnamese people's drive for mass literacy. One thing about these articles, not just these articles, but the other articles that also included Vietnam that I read, they tend to mash together North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Particularly during this period, it went from all colonized by the French to only to a independent North, but a still colonized South, and then finally the French left in 1954, but it was still separated North and South. So whenever they mention the little first steps of independence in Vietnam, they tend to, how would I put this? They tend to refer to all the success in North Vietnam at the beginning and kind of generalize that to the South as well. They don't mention any particulars about the South. They always mention, the revolutionary Ho Chi Minh really pushed for the use of Trung Quốc ngữ by everybody, and then finally they got rid of the French in 1954, but that's technically getting rid of the French from South Vietnam, because North Vietnam was already rid of the French, right? So the authors tend to mash together the time periods of North Vietnam, South Vietnam. When are they independent of each other? When are they separately colonized? When are they both colonized together as one? When are they Vietnam as one entity? They really don't kind of clarify those things in text, I find, regarding Vietnam in the 20th century. Okay. Next is Turkey, and in this article, the author compares the Turkish Romanization success to the Hebrews' attempt because they failed. So the author towards the beginning of the article presented a theoretical framework for factors that either cultivate or impeded the Romanization process. And this particular framework that they created is specifically for Romanization, doesn't really work for anything else but Romanization. And in these factors, they put a greater emphasis on social, cultural, economic, and religious factors, and they divided the whole thing into two sections for each cultivate and impede, and that is the technical infrastructural factors and the political cultural factors. And so with Turkey, because one of their main goals was secularization, that is why the author put a greater emphasis, including on religious factors. For this particular article, because the author put their framework first, followed by all of their supporting evidence and their further comparison between Turkish and Hebrew, it made me wonder if it created a bias on whether the reader agrees that this framework really is valid because of all the supporting evidence that comes afterwards. That kind of just makes the reader just like see all of the things that match between the evidence and the framework versus having the evidence first and then the framework at the end as more of like a deduction, because this author's thesis kind of made it sound like, well, they said that their aim was to create a framework, which implies that you're going to, through all this evidence, deduce a framework, or at least that's how I understood it. And so when I read it and it was vice versa, it made me question things a bit. Yeah, and moving on to commonalities. Between the three countries, there were a few commonalities. With China and Turkey, they both had authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. For Turkey, not explicitly a totalitarian regime, but as the author from the Turkish article stated, it was along the lines of one near the founding of the new republic. With Vietnamese and Turkish, the languages work quite well with the Latin alphabets, with a few additions and subtractions of certain letters. With all three, they all exhibit chaotic environments of the time. With China, it's going through tons of movements and tons of revolutions, regime changes, whatnot throughout the 20th century. Vietnam, they're coming out of a colonial period and declaring independence, founding new republics with North and South constantly, and then its reunification. And then with Turkey, they're founding a new republic coming out of being split from a very prominent empire. And then, of course, all three want to Romanize in a movement towards modernization and westernization. Now, with the differences, most of these were more of things that I observed from reading the articles, more so than were specifically on the framework. The only one actually on the framework was the first one for China, structural dissonance with the Latin alphabet, between the Latin alphabet and Standard Mandarin. And then the rest were observations. So we have the putting simplification between the original Chinese characters and Romanization, which I really think hindered China's opportunity of success with Romanization. Then also their government's inconsistent plans for Romanization throughout the 20th century, with all the changing regimes and just changing views within the same regime. And then with Vietnam, they're the only ones that were colonized by a foreign power. And then their Roman alphabet or Latin alphabet, which is Jiguknu, it was around since the mid 17th century, was more active within like religious circles because of foreign missionaries, but it's been around for centuries, versus the other ones were created toward the late 19th century. And then with Turkey, compared to China and Vietnam, their main goal was complete secularization in every single possible area that could be secularized in culture, society, government, everything. And that just shows the biggest difference between China, Vietnam, and then Turkey is their cultural difference. Um, and that is it for my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.